the young dudes James's perspective by Staying Dreams, Chapter 16. First Year, Astronomy. Great to have you back, Lupin, Sirius grinned, yanking back the invisibility cloak as they slipped into the previously locked defensive against the dark arts classroom. What do you mean? Remus asked, peering up from below as James climbed a rickety ladder in the corner of the room. The target was the cage of pixies perched on the highest shelf, a treasure Sirius had spotted earlier that week during class. I haven't been anywhere. Oh, come off it, mate, Peter piped up, holding the ladder steady for James. You've been avoiding us like we've got dragon pox. Peter's bluntness often came in handy, allowing him to ask questions James wouldn't, for fear of upsetting someone. I haven't, Remus said defensively, his brow furrowing. Just been busy, studying and stuff. Well, I hope you're over that phase now, James called down with a chuckle, carefully descending the ladder while clutching the large cage with both hands. I'd really appreciate it if you stopped working so hard. It's making me look bad, and I'm not used to this much competition. Oh, do one, Potter, Sirius scoffed, rummaging through some of the desks with a look of intense concentration. James refused to admit it out loud, but Sirius was his biggest rival in classes, often edging him out for top marks, not that he'd ever admit it. Remus had decided to join them for this prank, and James couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement at having the full group back together. It had been a while since they'd pulled a proper prank as a quartet, and James had missed it more than he'd let on. Sure, he could play the studious role when necessary, but causing mischief was where he truly shined. A life without it just felt dull. Remus crouched down to peer into the cage at the little blue pixies, clearly eager to change the subject. How are we going to get them into the Great Hall? The creatures were currently fast asleep, curled up at the bottom of the cage like tiny, mischievous babies. Under the cloak, James replied, spreading it wide so they could all squeeze underneath. Come on, Sirius, he added with an exaggerated eye roll, glancing at his friend, who was now on his hands and knees under the teacher's desk. What are you even looking for? Peter asked, his voice muffled under the cloak. One of the Ravenclaws told me there was a trapdoor under here, Sirius muttered, getting up and brushing the dust off his knees. Liar. This is Black's latest obsession, James explained for Remus's benefit, pinching the cloak shut over their heads. He's determined to find secret doors. Hogwarts history says there are loads of discovered passages, Sirius shot back defensively. Like that one you found, Lupin. There are definitely more. I'm going to find at least one before we leave this place. There's also supposed to be a monster hidden somewhere in the castle, James whispered back with mock seriousness as they crept through the dimly lit corridors toward Gryffindor Tower. Peter shivered, either from the chill in the air or the thought of the supposed beast lurking about. A risk I'm willing to take, Sirius replied, with a grin that James could hear in his voice. My legacy is far more important. Typical, James laughed, shaking his head. Leave it to Sirius to prioritize his internal glory over not getting eaten by some ancient hidden creature. But then, again, that's exactly what made him Sirius Black. Fearless, reckless, and utterly brilliant. The sort of friend you couldn't help but follow, even if you did end up in detention, or worse, because of it. The next evening at dinner, James was grinning like a madman, trying, quite successfully, if you asked him, not to look as though he was hiding 50 sleeping pixies under the table. Peter, meanwhile, who was surprisingly good at astronomy, was busy checking over the other Marauders' star charts. They had all been assigned to label every star, and James had to admit it was a mind-nobblingly dull task. Sirius, of course, had spent their astronomy class earlier in the week scribbling down nonsense, barely paying attention to anything except, perhaps, how many times he could get the professor to raise an eyebrow at him. His homework was in a sorry state, and Peter was frowning at it, cool poised, as if it might magically improve. Honestly, think you'd at least get your own bloody star right, Peter muttered, pressing something out with a sigh. Sirius just laughed, completely unbothered. What can I say? I'm hopeless. You've got your own star? Remus asked, looking up from his plate. James shot him a sympathetic grin. He wasn't much for astronomy either. The only thing he knew about space was that the sun rose every morning, which was really all that mattered. Serious, Peter replied, exasperated, as if they'd covered this 1,000 times. Come on, Lupin, we've been over this. It's the brightest star in the sky, the dog star. He gave a long-suffering sigh, but James could see a glint of pride in Peter's eyes. It wasn't often he got to teach one of them something instead of the other way around. He glanced down at Remus's homework, shaking his head. Yep, you've missed it too. Remus just shrugged. I just thought it was his name. The noble and most ancient House of Black has always been a bit Aussie with its naming conventions, Sirius mused, clearly enjoying the attention. Half of us have astronomical names. There's Bellatrix, of course, my dad's Orion, my brother's Regulus. Mom's not a star, but I reckon she's an asteroid. Pretty apt if you've ever seen her in a bad mood. Then there's good old Uncle Alfred, Uncle Cygnus, Andromedas, named after an entire galaxy. Wizards are so weird, Remus sighed, shaking his head in that resigned way of his that made James want to ruffle his hair. Remus, James sniggered, leaning closer. You do know that Lupus is a constellation too, don't you? The wolf. The what? Remus yelped, nearly choking on his dinner. James reached out, lightly patting his head, his grin fading slightly at the sudden look of panic in Remus's eyes. Remus had these moments sometimes, where fear flashed across his face, raw and unfiltered, and James never quite knew what to do about it. He'd seen the same reaction when Snape's sweets had caused fur to spurt from their arms, and now, again, at the mention of the wolf constellation. James couldn't put his finger on the connection, but he wished he could, if only to help his friend somehow. Sirius, ever the master of deflection, slapped Remus hard on the back, shifting the conversation. If you're done telling us how thick we are, Pete, can we get on with releasing the you-know-whats? My darling cousins have just started eating. I'd call that perfect timing. The others nodded eagerly, and James gave the cage a sharp kick to rouse the pixies before wiping off the invisibility cloak and muttering a quick unlocking charm. The effect was immediate and spectacular, an explosion of bright blue chaos as the pixies shot out like miniature comets. James had been buzzing with anticipation to see the pixies in action, and now he could see why they were considered such pests. The little creatures zoomed out from under the table, scattering in every direction and chattering in their high-pitched voices as they wreaked havoc. They dove into soup tureens, snatched forks out of students' hands, and brandished them like tridents, tore up homework, and yanked at hair and ropes with wild abandon. Quick! James stalked back under the table, where they all crouched beneath the invisibility cloak, watching the mayhem unfold around them. Brilliant! Sirius whispered, his grin practically splitting his face as he watched the chaos they'd unleashed. Come on, Remus urged, nudging them forward. Though James was keen to stay and admire their handiwork, he knew Remus had the right idea. The plan was to observe for a bit, then slip out of the hall before they could be pinned as the culprits. It took some awkward shuffling to navigate out from under the table without being trampled by fleeing students or dive-bombed by enraged pixies. But they managed, thanks to the invisibility cloak. They were invisible and unbothered, though the same couldn't be said for anyone else in the hall. Girls were screaming, boys were shouting, and everyone was ducking for cover from the blue streaks whizzing around the room. The pixies had no problem turning the entire great hall upside down. "Oh, yes!" Sirius suddenly crowed, unable to contain himself. James followed his gaze and saw Bellatrix, her face twisted in rage, as she shrieked at the top of her lungs. Her wild hair was being tugged violently by several pixies, while another was waving her own wand at her, zapping out little bursts of blue lightning. "Get off me, you filthy, you disgusting, you are!" she wails, while her sister cowered under the table, clutching her wand for dear life. The chaos escalated when Peeves, the poltergeist, joined in, gleefully adding to the bedlam as he zipped about the hall, directing the pixies like a mad conductor. He lifted tablecloths, cackling maniacally. "Under here, pixies! Lots of equally thirsties down here." The marauders, barely able to stifle their laughter, took that as their cue to flee. They bottled from the room just as McGonagall's shrill voice rang out. "Precipitous to Talus!" "She's definitely going to know it was us," Peter planted, as they hurried back to Gryffindor Tower, still in the cloak. "Nah," James replied with a casual wave of his hand. "She'll blame it on the pre-weeds. They always pull off big stuff like this. Something to aspire to, really." Sirius snickered, and James couldn't help but grin. All in all, it had been a job well done, and if McGonagall did suspect him, well, that was half the fun, wasn't it? "Please," Sirius whined, his voice taking on that irritatingly persistent tone that made it clear he wasn't going to drop this any time soon. Remus shook his head, exasperated. "No." "Please!" Sirius drew out the word like a child begging for a sweet. "No!" Remus repeated, trying to sound firm, but sounding more like he was pleading for mercy. "Why not?" "It would just feel weird. I don't want you to. But it'll be fun. I promise you'll enjoy it." "Ha!" The conversation had dragged on like this for the past 3 corridors, and James was starting to lose patience. Remus had resorted to walking faster, as if he could escape the discussion entirely, while James trailed behind them, exchanging wary looks with Peter. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore and decided to intervene. "Leave Lupin alone, will you?" James said, trying to inject some authority into his voice, even though he knew from experience it rarely worked on Sirius. "I will not. This is important," Sirius shot back, his restless energy making him extra obnoxious. James knew this mood well. Sirius, on a mission, was relentless, and usually James was the only one who could reel him in, at least a little. The whole thing had started after a long, mid-numbing study session in the library, where they'd spent the afternoon working on zodiac charts for astronomy revision. Exams were still ages away, but James had wanted to get a head start, and he knew Sirius had only agreed so he could beat him, as usual. Peter tagged along because he always did, and Remus had been there too, though he seemed less icy than he had been recently. James wasn't sure what had caused Remus to come out of his shell, but he wasn't about to question it. He was just glad to have his friend back, and was determined to keep an eye on him so he wouldn't retreat again. They'd been chatting about star signs when it came out that Remus was a Pisces, and Sirius, ever the quick thinker, had immediately realized that meant Remus's birthday was coming up. That's when the pleading had started. "It's obviously not that important to Remus," James insisted, hoping to defuse the situation before it got out of hand. "Do something for my birthday instead, if you have to. It's not long after." "You'll get your turn," Sirius dismissed him with a wave. "But first, Lupin." "I really don't care, Sirius," Remus sighed as they reached the portrait of the fat lady. "Don't make a fuss." "But it's your birthday," Sirius protested, sounding genuinely hurt. "We should make a fuss." James understood where Sirius was coming from. Birthdays were a big deal. Time to show how much you cared about someone. James's parents had always made a big thing of his birthdays, every single year better than the last. That was why he'd been so determined to celebrate Sirius's birthday properly, to give him that same feeling of being cared for. And now Sirius wanted to do the same for Remus, but it was clear Remus didn't want it forced on him. "Why does it matter so much?" Remus huffed, clambering through the portrait hole. James could sense the irritation rising in him, the kind that usually surfaced when Sirius was being particularly stubborn. James knew, though, that Sirius only got like this when he really cared. Sirius was the type who couldn't give you a second thought if you didn't matter to him. But if he did care, Merlin, he'd move mountains for you, bring you all the stars in the sky if you asked him to. That was why James could never stay upset with Sirius when he got in these moods. It was all coming from a good place, even if it was a bit much. As James clambered through the portrait hole last, he noticed Sirius rubbing his arm, looking oddly vulnerable for someone usually so brash. "You bought all the stuff for my birthday and, well, it was really nice. I never much looked forward to it before, but, well, it was great, wasn't it?" James shot Remus a knowing glance. Surely he could see now that this wasn't about Sirius craving attention. It was about making Remus happy. It was something that they could do for him, something small but meaningful, especially when they all knew Remus didn't have much. It was just a little thing, but sometimes the little things meant the most. Remus hesitated, his gaze softening as he took in Sirius's earnest expression. "Oh, okay, fine, but not a big party or anything, just the marauders, yeah?" "Right," Sirius grinned, his whole face lighting up in a way that made James's heart swell. Of course, James didn't believe for a second that Sirius wouldn't turn it into something bigger, but seeing the way Sirius's eyes sparkled, James decided to let it go. Who was he to spoil that kind of happiness?